It's one of those social media explosions that you see from time to time. All the big sports stars like Ronaldo and American football player Myles Garrett, actor John Cusack, the Pope, all raft of celebrities who some of them I've never heard of, start tweeting, Facebooking. That's good, I guess, right? Because it does get your attention. But what comes with that is a lot of emotion and not always fact.
Yes.
We need to find out that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of the fake news stuff about the Amazon, but obviously we're losing a football field a minute. This year now it's 2 football fields a minute. It's sad that we had to have fires to notice we were losing a football field a minute. Yes, there is a lot of information that needs to be clarified, but we had someone help that, haven't we?
We sure do. One of the world's most respected voices on habitat fragmentation and wildfires in bush and forested areas is Professor Bill Laurance. He's a distinguished research professor at James Cook University in Cairns, Australia, and he holds an Australian Laureate Fellowship, one of Australia's highest scientific awards, and he loves this show, and he's been on it several times. He's with us now. Professor Laurance, great to have you on board. How are you this morning?
I'm very good, boys. Thank you. I really do like being on this show.
Thank you, sir. Now, it's a bit of a worry, and it's right in your area of expertise. We've had some facts that I think are right. 73,000 fires through the Amazon. Countries like Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, Guyana, all on fire, and people are saying the Amazon gives us 20% of the world's oxygen. Bill Laurance, is that true?
I think those kinds of ballpark figures are true. It's a little bit of a furphy in the sense that we're not really worried about the oxygen. There's plenty of oxygen in the atmosphere. So people do talk about the Amazon being very important for oxygen supply, but in fact, the reason that we want to stop the destruction of the Amazon is slightly more subtle and nuanced. For instance, I'll give you a few things that are happening. When you destroy the forest, you release massive amounts of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane, which are very important in global warming. The forests themselves are really critical in terms of pumping water vapor up into the atmosphere, massive amounts. So there's a gigantic moisture engine that actually helps to drive the whole planet's moisture and rainfall and precipitation cycles right up to North America, into the higher latitudes and down into southern South America and places like that. The exact amounts, we're not sure, but we know that we can just follow the tracks of the smoke, and we can see that, going right down into southern Brazil and southern South America, we can see places like Sao Paulo. It looks like it's almost late at night there. It's so dark. They're saying it's the equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes a day. We know airports are being closed, schools are being closed. We know that there's been this very big spike in fires and in forest burning and destruction.
Yep.
So the Amazon does a lot of really important things, but the lungs of the planet sounds like such a great concept, but truth is it's not really as much about oxygen as about some of this other stuff.
Right. Yeah. What's actually burning then? Are we talking about thick jungle habitat that you might see on a Hollywood film? I'm wondering what animals and plants are burning right now.
Well, when people talk about things like 73,000 or 75,000 fires, they're actually talking about across the entirety of Brazil. And the truth is probably 2/3 of those fires, but this is just normal in any normal year. 2/3 of those fires are actually taking place out in cattle pastures and in areas where there's been some scrubby regrowth that's regenerated. The ranchers, which there's a lot of ranching in Brazil, the ranchers like to burn their pastures every year to produce a flush of green grass for the cattle and to control weeds. So that's normal.
Right.
But you can still use the total number of fires as kind of a quick snapshot of what's happening year to year. And the actual truth is we're seeing this huge pulse, effectively a doubling of the number of fires compared to last year and the year before. And we also know the thing that really counts, and what you're talking about, I think it was either Phil or Paul, what you're talking about there is actual destruction of old growth rainforest. We know that that's almost double relative to the last couple of years.
Yeah,
and it takes a little longer to talk about that, but it's happening.
Now, Bill, scientists were saying if the tree loss in the Amazon was to pass a certain tipping point, somewhere between 25 and 40%, that the deforestation could start to feed on itself and lead to the demise of the entire forest within a matter of decades. I'm sort of trying to understand, how does exactly a forest ecosystem feed on itself, and how does that tipping point work?
Yeah, okay, so gigantic areas of forest, and the two classical ones that we're talking about here are the Amazon basin and the Congo basin, have a similar situation in which they're massive areas of forest and they're a long way from the nearest ocean. And so that means that the moisture that comes, although it ultimately comes from the ocean, in fact, as the moisture moves across the Amazon, what happens is it gets recycled. So when you get a rainstorm in the Amazon, very quickly about half or more of that water is recycled right back up into the atmosphere in the form of water. And this just happens as a part of photosynthesis. It's just part of the plant's normal, metabolic cycle.
Right.
Anyway, that moisture is absolutely critical in terms of forming clouds and in creating more rainfall. And it's especially critical in the dry season months when the forests are most vulnerable to being burned and destroyed. In the wet season, we know that intertropical convergence zone, or in Australia what they call the monsoonal trough, we know that usually comes down and brings with it lots of rain.
Yeah.
But you don't have that in the dry season. So the only thing that you've got is the moisture that the forest is recycling itself, and it's keeping things cloudy and moist, and that's critical. And then on top of that, we're basically opening up the Amazon like a flayed fish with all these new roads.
Yes.
Yeah.
Making it much more vulnerable to fires. Making it much easier for people, which cause 99.99% of the fires to enter these areas and to use fires for forest destruction. There's lots of other things happening, and we could talk about this whole fire dynamic at some length, but the bottom line is, if there is a lot of concern that when the forests become fragmented enough or degraded enough or diminished enough, that rainfall recycling will collapse. And it will then suddenly, your dry seasons are going to become much more catastrophic.
Yeah.
And again, we already know the forest is every year becoming much more vulnerable to fire because people are ripping trees out of the forest and fragmenting the forest and putting all these roads in.
So it sounds like, Professor Laurance, it's more the long-term effects of these fires that we need to be concerned about more so than what's actually burning today. Is that about right?
Well, I think it's kind of both. I mean, if you were living in the Amazon and it's the equivalent of smoking 20 cigarettes a day,
right,
and for instance, that the hospitals are just filling up with cases with people in respiratory distress. If your kids couldn't go to school, if the airports are closed, I mean, it's happening, and then its impacts on biodiversity.
Sure.
It's having a very real effect right now. And it also may be, it's probably also influencing or reducing water supplies, rainfall supplies, in other parts of the world where that's absolutely crucial for irrigation, for energy supplies, for cities, for the environment. There's lots of critical reasons why you got to have water.
Yep.
And the Amazon being this massive source of moisture is not just keeping itself wet, but in fact it's driving moisture up into the higher latitudes. Like there's a strong evidence that in southern South America and probably the American Midwest and possibly the American West are going to have a very strong long-term effect, and this is really what you're getting into, a very strong long-term effect of Amazon deforestation by having less overall rainfall, or less. A lot of it falls as snow too in the wintertime, which is critical for them. They're going to have less of that, and so they're going to be a lot more droughts and fires, in these other places.
Right, so that's getting on to that long-term effect. I have a question I've really wanted to ask you today is, beside losing the forest sinks and this problem with the redistribution of moisture, this year, particularly around the globe, we've had just fires everywhere, and the Arctic lost 12 million hectares as well. When will those emissions start being picked up at Mauna Loa as far as our CO2 global ppms go?
Yes. Well, we tend to think of CO2, carbon dioxide, as being fairly, uniformly mixed in the atmosphere. That's not quite true, but it mixes fairly rapidly. So those big fires, and they are frightening that we're seeing up in these places where we don't normally see big fires. In addition to the tropics, where we have been seeing a lot of fires, oftentimes, those are going to start showing up right away. And, we can estimate, but they should be picked up by Mauna Loa. I'd say probably, might take a month for them to sort of circulate through the atmosphere. I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but, ballpark.
Yeah.
It's not like it's going to take years for that to show up. It'll be pretty rapid.
All right. Well, Bill Laurance, I guess the final thing, if you care to comment or not, is on the Brazilian president himself, sometimes called Tropical Trump. Why has he seemingly waged this war against the environment?
Well, he's a very extreme, right candidate, and he's pro-development, but almost to the point of being rabidly anti-environment. And I think he sincerely believes that the indigenous lands in Brazil and the national parks and protected areas are holding up development. He wants to kickstart the Brazilian economy at many different levels, but he's going about it in a pretty ridiculous way. I mean, he's grossly defunded the National Environmental Protection Agency. He's basically said to people, go ahead and go out and burn. This government's not going to prosecute you. So the illegal burning, which is so bad in the past, is coming back. And then he's just said a lot. There's a reason why they call him the Tropical Trump. He's done a lot of and said a lot of really crazy things. For instance, he fired the president of Brazil's National Space Agency. This would be like firing the director of NASA, very respected guy, for reporting these big increases in fires. And Bolsonaro said, lies. The guy said, they're not lies. He said, come to our offices and we'll show you why they're not lies. And Bolsonaro fired him. The other thing Bolsonaro said is, he said, it's all those environmentalists and those indigenous rights groups. They're the ones lighting the fires.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, it's you, Bill. Stop doing
That's
it.
right. That's why Trump says Bolsonaro is such a great bloke.
Yeah, I'm half U.S. and half Aussie, so I'm studying it from both sides. I mean, imagine, waking up and reading the morning news, and I just don't know where to hide,